Welcome to the Why We Write Fantasy podcast, a podcast about all the reasons why we love to write and read fantasy, with your hosts, Oscar Cesena and KJ Aiello.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of Why We Write Fantasy podcast. My name is Oscar Cesena.
And I am KJ Aiello, and I'm excited to be back here with you, Oscar.
Today, we're talking about using fantasy to retell a story and using fantasy
Yes.
as a mechanism for retelling. I think it would be interesting for our listeners to hear how you and I use
Mhm.
fantasy to retell a story or to understand stories.
Right. So, what we're talking about specifically is the world building aspect of fantasy. Um, and there's so much that you can do with world building in fantasy. And again, going back to the last episode when we were talking about world building before, is that world building isn't necessarily, like creating a map and creating a geopolitical system, yada, yada. It can be a lot more than that. It can be a lot smaller than that, a lot subtler than that. But what we're looking at here is specifically how can you build a world, whether it's big or small, to retell a story that already exists? And not necessarily, an actual narrative, but sort of a concept, an idea, something in our history or something, specific within ourselves. So I have a couple of examples here that I actually really gravitate towards in different aspects. So like these writers used world building to retell a story in completely different ways. And the first one is R.F. Kong, Babels. So this novel is fantastic. I finished it a couple of weeks ago. And what she does with this one is it's set in Victorian England in Oxford, and she uses magic, a magic system that actually takes language. So there's an appropriation of language there by the English Empire, the British Empire, and embeds that into these silver magic bars. And then from that, the British Empire actually profits. But what they're doing is they're profiting from colonialism and oppression and that sort of thing. So, what I understood from Babel, what I learned from Babel was that colonialism, appropriation, oppression, it's not necessarily something that is quite so tangible as I've been taught before. There's also the appropriation of language, of culture, of ideas. And this is what she's trying to get at with this. So she's retelling the story of colonialism and appropriation of language and ideas using her fantasy world that she's created, which I think is super cool.
It
And
is
then the
pretty
next
cool.
one, it's so cool. It's a really, really good book. I was blown away. So, and the next one, I particularly love this one. It's called At the Edge of the Universe by Sean David Hutchison, and he's one of my favorite writers because of what he does with fantasy. And it's not really like it could be in the general fiction, but it could also be in the fantasy section. And this novel is actually about a teenage boy who his world is literally the universe is literally shrinking. And as it gets closer and closer and closer to him where he physically is, people start to disappear and the memories of them disappear. It's like they never existed. So as it gets shrinks in farther and farther and farther, he gets more and more desperate. Um, and it's actually a metaphor for mental illness, depression, suicide,
Yeah.
suicidal ideation. And he never outright says those words, but it's just the way he wrote it, the way he created that world, that is all in the character's head, is so incredible. And it makes it a lot easier to empathize with mental illness and depression and what somebody might be going through. So that's what I love about using world building as retelling.
I think there's an interesting piece on that. I think one of the things that I really liked about fantasy as a tool for retelling stories is how you can retell something that happened in our history, like in our past,
Mhm.
and make it more accessible for other
Yeah.
people to understand it. And I think for me, the example there, like I'm thinking about that. For me, the example might be Star Wars, which is something that I grew up with. Like I was a kid and I was fascinated by the Star Wars universe at the time. There were only three
Mhm.
movies, right? There's not the massive um,
Yeah.
entertainment empire that is right now. But
Yeah.
at the time, there were three movies. But I was fascinated by them because if you think about it, like like I think about like all the planets that you visit during Star Wars, and most of
Mhm,
them are just like they have like one climate. Like it's a planet that is a
mhm,
swamp, and that's it. And there's a planet that is a desert, and that's it.
mhm,
And I think one of the cool things about there is that if you think about like talking about the British Empire, you were talking in Babel, um, maybe taking it to a completely different direction, but it's maybe a little bit similar to like the how the British Empire expanded, and each one of these planets, which has their own climate and their own culture, that the whole culture is the whole planet, it's the same culture.
mhm.
It's just one country. This is how the British Empire expanded. And if you look a little further into that, like without getting into the um like the story itself, just like thinking about world building, as we said, like the world
Right.
of Star Wars, you have for example, the empire is structured as the Nazi regime. Like that was the
Yeah.
idea. Like you have one person at the top, you have a few in the back, you have the example, the SS, like all those things, you have them there. And
Mhm.
even the scenes that you have there, they're very very similar to videos that you can find about like I don't know, like parades
World War II.
on
Yeah.
Germany like even before the war. Like we're thinking about like Munich earlier before the war. You have this footage of like like massive, I don't know, like demonstrations of power. And I think that was one of
Yeah.
the things that Star Wars got there from there. And again, like think continue with the world building. Jedi's are basically feudal Japan, right? You have this the system of
Yeah.
honor, those things. So I took that as a kid. I was like maybe
Mhm,
6 years old or something like that when I was fascinated about it. So when I was actually exposed to real history, for me it was really easy to understand. It's like,
mhm.
oh, okay, so this is similar to that. Okay, so these guys are the evil empire. Oh, these guys are the Jedi's. Like those type of things, and it just made it easier for me to assimilate things that at my when I was 6 years old, if someone started talking to me about the war, World War II, for example, or something like that, I would maybe I wouldn't be interested at all, and for sure I wouldn't
Mhm.
understand anything. So I think that for me,
Right.
that part of retelling is the important part. Like it actually helped me to like open my eyes there into that. Like it's and again, I think like going back to Star Wars and the world building, Star Wars is. I mean, some people say it's sci-fi. I'm gonna stay with that. It's fantasy because you have the Force is magic, and
It is totally magic, yeah.
that like for me it's fantasy. I mean, sci-fi and fantasy are very 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 close together, but
They're cousins.
yeah, yeah. But what I'm thinking is like in the case of Star Wars, like it's not about the future. Like you're actually even the structure, the empire, and all that. They're depicting the past. They're depicting the empires, the old empires
Mhm.
from before, where you have like this massive
Yeah.
army and you are colonizing planets in this case.
Yeah.
And it just made it easier. Like I think it's one of the good things, especially for younger minds. It's
Mhm.
really good to have those type of things because you can retell this story as a movie that you would take your kids to
Yeah.
watch in the theater, but you wouldn't take your kids to watch a documentary about World War II when they're
No,
six,
not
right?
necessarily.
Right. So
I mean, most people wouldn't.
yeah, I guess it depends on the like if it's a
So
Ken Burns documentary, you're pretty sure you won't. But yeah,
yeah.
but anyway, that I think that's part of the how retelling can help other people, especially if you're writing something, you're retelling like that.
Yeah.
It actually it's pretty good. And KJ, you were talking about like some good examples about retelling. Um, one of the ones
Mhm.
that I can think of, it's for example Terry Pratchett. I love Terry Pratchett, and I'm pretty sure
Mhm.
like almost every fantasy reader loves Terry Pratchett because he's just hilarious. But I'm thinking I actually grabbed a list of a few books that I read and I love them. Like I have like Going Postal, which is even though it's set up in the this world that by default it's a world that is flat, so by default is fantasy. Like it
Yeah,
talks a
yeah.
lot about the issues with the mailing system that we have. And then you have like this is funny because the character's name is Moist von Lipwig.
I love
It's
it.
just it's an
That's just
amazing name.
so Horrible,
Yeah,
but great.
horrible but great. Yeah, and he has a
Yeah, you just
he has a second book. Well, Terry Pratchett wrote a second book with this character that is
yeah,
called
yeah.
Making Money, which kind of like deals
I mean,
with the idea of introducing paper money into a system, and he does it in
right.
such an easy and accessible way and so funny that you start understanding those things. And the same
That's
thing
amazing.
with
Yeah.
yeah, and the same thing with other ones that he has. Like I grabbed a couple more. Snuff that kind of like deals with racism and slavery in a way,
Mhm.
and also Small Gods. Small Gods. I think it's a perfect example of how organized religion works. And
Right.
the
Yeah.
way you read it, and it's again fantasy. It's very accessible. Anyone would read it, and it makes you think. It starts like just moving your brain in a direction that it might like just spark the curiosity on learning something different.
Yeah, like you said, it makes it more accessible, but it's also a way to be able to access, um, history and historical events and, different systems and ways of being for folks who actually would have never, been interested in that sort of thing before. So it gives us actually a deeper understanding of our world, even though it may be set in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah,
There are a lot of similarities. And then through that, we can understand how what we did, how we can do better, how, particular outcomes would be if we did XYZ, if we shot, I don't know,
yeah,
laser beams at a Death Star or something. I don't know. Not that we have a Death Star, but that would be really cool if there was a Death Star.
it was super
I'm just
cool. Yeah,
saying. Right. But I mean, and this is part of the thing that I love about using world building as retelling is because it's a way to actually, I think of it like Star Trek's holodeck. And this is how I wrote about it in my book. I really did a deep dive into using this world building as retelling. And I interviewed some folks. But if you have fantasy is like a blank slate, it's like you pretty much don't even have the rules that we would have here on Earth. There's so many things that you can do with it. Even if your world is set on Earth, but you create the world in your character's head, there's nearly no limits.
yeah,
And what that is like to me is like Star Trek's holodeck. So what you can do is you can create this setting, you can create these scenarios, and then you can chuck your characters into them and see what they do. So you can actually test your character's limits. And for some folks, actually using, tabletop RPGs, role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, like Pathfinder, they were actually able to use that to be able to explore traumas in their own past, to be able to come up with a sort of a new perspective, right? It was cathartic for them. And one individual I interviewed, he actually he used Dungeons and Dragons as a way to explore gender, and he's a trans man. So when he was playing in the 1990s, he was still, the non-affirmed gender of female. So, but he actually explored what it was like to be male, and it was through Dungeons and Dragons that he was able to finally say, you know what, this is it. I am not a woman, I'm a man. And I think that's incredible that we can use this storytelling, these worlds as a way to explore possibilities. And
hmm
that's the psychology part that I love about it. Yeah, that's my
and
take.
and I think it's a fascinating take, especially when we talk about games. I think the difference between like you have a book that you're reading, you get immersed with the characters, with the world, but there's
Mhm.
nothing you can do there. When you're playing an
Yeah,
RPG, especially like a tabletop RPG, you're telling the story together, so anything
yeah,
can change. Your character could be whoever you want it to be. So I think
yeah,
that's a really good way. And I mean, I mentioned this before. I've been playing TTRPGs for 30 years, and it always been. I don't believe that me as a game master. I don't see myself as a storyteller because I do not control the story.
mhm,
I It's a story that we build together as players, game masters. It's more like
mhm,
I set the boundaries and I set the rules. It's more like a kind of like a rule maker or a rule enforcer, if you want,
yeah,
than storyteller. A lot of people think about game mastering as a storytelling device, but honestly, the story is each person's character, and we
yeah,
just do it together. And I think it's one of the cool things. And like stories like the one you just told, I think it's just. adds a little more to the value of having all these alternatives that we can do.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. And it's safe. It's a safe place to do it because, particularly when it comes to exploring trauma, um, again, Star Trek's holodeck, if it becomes too dangerous, you can just hit reset. And the
yeah,
same thing goes with writing. If you're working on a storyline and you're building this world, and then all of a sudden for you, or maybe for your character, it's just, I don't know about this. Like this feels a bit too much for me right now, or whatever the case may be. You can hit reset. And that's what I
hmm,
love about fantasy, or you can change the world a little bit. Like you are, I say you are the author of the world, but you literally are. But I mean author as in authorial. You have the authority over it, which, for a lot of folks, particularly who've dealt with trauma or mental illness or both, um, having that control, and both control and freedom, is, I think, really healthy. I think it's really beneficial, and I think that there's a lot that we can do with that as writers. So, yeah, that's
I,
that's my TED Talks.
yeah, because in the end, like you said, like, as when you're writing your own world, and I think that's kind of like the difference between it, because I was thinking about like reading a book and then playing a TTRPG, but there's like
Yeah,
a third option, which is the one that we should be talking
we
about, which is
do.
writing.
It's writing.
And you can decide anything you want. Now you become the storyteller because you control the story, you
Yeah.
control the world, you make the rules, you do everything that you want, and you can explore even things that happened in the past or might happen in the future, like all this dystopian um, books and movies and TV shows that are happening. Like, I think that's part of what makes us human. Like, one of the things I like about like
Mm,
dystopian worlds is I believe they're like a reflection of our fears, like our current fears, right? The dystopian worlds that we like. Like, I think about cyberpunk. Cyberpunk was born like
mhm.
when capitalism was growing, crime was growing, drugs were like becoming a big issue, and then you have this,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Yeah.
right now we have like all this idea of like what's happening with AI. AI is taking over our
Mhm.
jobs, our world, all those things.
Let
So
me think.
a lot of the dystopia that's going to be created right now will be related to those fears. So I
Yeah, and I
think
think too, like Emily St. John Mandel, you actually told me about her novel,
Station
Station
11,
11. And she wrote it before the pandemic, but now it's kind of like, "Oh, wait a second," you know?
yeah, even though she wrote it before the pandemic, and it was like a way bigger pandemic than the one we experienced.
Yeah.
Uh, it kind of builds in our fears, right? It's like we
Mhm,
before that we might not even consider like a pandemic. Like, you remember like Stephen
mhm.
King's The Stand, I believe it is The Stand, which is
Yeah.
like it's a
Mhm.
pandemic as well. And again, it's one of the fears that we have, like something that we cannot control is going to come and destroy us.
Yeah. But through that too, being able to explore those stories and to be able to write them ourselves, it's also a way to us to sort of, it's almost like a test situation, a test scenario. So Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11 versus Stephen King's The Stand, they're different. They're different stories, they're different outcomes, different
Yeah.
characters, but it's that the author's sort of envisioning, interpretation, exploration of what could possibly happen. Right?
Hmm.
So I think that, like, and I actually read an article a while ago. It was for research for my own book, and why over the pandemic, apocalyptic, dystopian, and even pandemic literature novels were
Hmm.
selling like hotcakes. People were watching them on TV, yada
Yeah.
yada yada. And I mean, I don't know if this is true, but my kind of feeling is like we're going to this subconsciously to be able to see what is actually going to happen, because we need to know, right? We are a species, humans. We need to
Yeah.
know what's going to happen. We need explanations. So I think for dystopian and apocalyptic and that sort of thing, it's actually a way for us to be able to explore all these different scenarios. Okay, so this scenario could possibly happen. How would our world look like? This scenario could happen. How would our world look like? Yada, yada, yada. And I think, yes, it plays on our fears, but maybe it also helps us feel a bit more in control.
That is
I don't
true.
know.
Yeah. I
Maybe.
think one of the
I
things
could
that
be
we
wrong.
do, I don't know. At least from my point of view, you're right, because that's one of the things that I do. Like, if I don't know, I'm going
Yeah.
to do research. Like you
Yeah.
said, like I remember when the pandemic hit, like in the very beginning, I had the news on all day. Like I was
All the time.
working in one
Yes.
monitor, I was working, and the other one I had the news.
News.
Like
Yeah.
there was no music, no nothing. There was the news. I wanted to know what was happening, and
Yeah.
I wasn't the only one. Everybody was doing that,
Yeah.
and I think it's because of
Yeah.
that. But I think if you think about like something maybe not as tangible as the pandemic as it hit, like
Mhm.
even the fears that we have, it just they become this dystopian worlds. Like the worlds that
Yeah.
we see in dystopia are like either uh, plagued by crime, like
Mhm.
brutal capitalism. Um, I'm thinking about like Brave New World, where you have a new
Yeah.
caste system that is based on intelligence or not on skin or where you were born or money. You think
Mhm.
about like 1984, and you have a world that is completely surveyed. Like you have all the surveillance and everything.
Surveillance,
So
yeah.
all those things that are, I mean, I think every day become a little more normal, but still there are fears that we
Mhm.
have. And those books were like Brave New World was like what 30 something, and 1984 was written
Yeah.
in 1854, like after the war.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and those things just become the fear of the time. It just becomes the way we're writing right now, and I really
Yeah, and
like
I
that.
know that yeah, you have a particular love for dystopian sci-fi and fantasy. I don't know if
Yeah,
you feel
so
comfortable right now like this is your thing, but you're actually writing a novel about this, and I think, like, I've only read snippets of it, and I'm just dying for you to actually, like, finish a draft that you would allow me
yeah.
to read.
So yeah, I can tell you. I'm not gonna tell you about like the plot or anything because I'm still working on it, and I'm pretty excited with it. But I can tell you a little bit about the world. The world that I'm building is not it's not really like apocalyptic or anything like that, like post-apocalyptic or anything like that. It's more like a, like I would, the way I think it is more like an evolved cyberpunk. Like
Mhm,
I'm trying to think about the, like the issues, because I love cyberpunk. I grew up reading cyberpunk, like watching Blade Runner, The Matrix, like all those things that I really like. And there are also many influences, like for example like Children of Men. It's a book that I have
mhm.
never read the book, but I love the movie. It's basically
Yeah.
the, if you're listening and you haven't watched that movie, it's awesome,
It's
so go
so
and watch
good,
it.
it's so good,
So
yeah.
good. But anyway, what I was thinking is in the world that I have is thinking about how the world will look in 100 years or something,
Yeah.
is what I'm trying to do. So I know that the main issue right now is not drugs and violence and crime and all that it was in the cyberpunk from the 80s, but it is
Mhm,
global warming. We're facing global warming, and it's something that is affecting everybody in the world. So even the way I'm building the world, is it going to be like what happens to like Florida or
mhm.
Central America or the
Yeah.
islands in the Caribbean? Are they going to exist in 100 years, 200 years in my world? But that's kind of the idea. Like I do love dystopian worlds. Honestly, if there's just like a dystopian fantasy or sci-fi world, just threw me in there, and I'm gonna be
Yeah.
super happy. So
Oscar loves that.
yeah, it's yeah, I can. And like even little things like it kind of like portrays a little bit about our fears.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know.
I have like, some similar things I'm working on or struggling or dying over writing a novel right now. In between editing the book that I've already got. Like, why not, right? But I'm working on it's not about the world, like what would the world look like, when climate change takes over, when capitalism is just like has exploded, anything like that. I'm working on the inner world with a character who lives with trauma, unresolved trauma and psychosis. So she actually, because of the trauma that she experienced when she was a kid, her psyche fractured, which is actually it's like this psychological I don't know, tool. I don't have the right word for it, but it's something that kids do. They are able to compartmentalize certain traumatic moments or aspects of themselves into sort of like a magical creature or a magical moment or something like that. They always put this sort of like a magical spin on it. So I wanted to play with that in that these different aspects of my character's psyche have fractured into actual magical creatures, but being able to do this in a way that is both believable in the fact that, these creatures don't do they truly exist? Like, we don't really know, or are they a figment of her imagination? Or, but also keeping this thread that, mental illness, um, that these characters actually represent mental illness is so difficult, So I have to do a ton of research.
Yeah.
I write about mental illness all the time, but this is just like I feel like I've taken on a lot. But, this is one of the things that I love to do, but this is all again about world building as retelling. It's finding a
Yeah.
way to tell a story in a different way through fantasy that maybe makes it more accessible to everyone. You know what I mean? Exploring.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Honestly, I would love if you're listening to this and you, I'm talking to you, listener, not you, KJ. If anyone here that is listening and is doing something like that, we would love to hear it. We would love to, like,
Yes.
yeah, let us know. We would love to hear
Yeah.
that, because again, this is our opinion. This is the way we deal with things. It's not the way, the only way. There's many ways to do things.
Yeah.
So we always love to hear those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can use our hashtag if you wanted to post something on Instagram. It's hashtag WWWF. Our Instagram is at Why We Write Fantasy. Reach out to us via email. Our email is on our website, whywritefantasy.com. Would love to hear from you. This is what we do as writers, and we need to build this community, get some ideas from each other, and get support from one another. I think it's the most important part of a writing
I agree.
community.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, at some point we're going to have an episode about writing groups and why they helped us,
Writing
but it's
care.
not today.
Soon,
I
soon.
soon, yeah, at some point. I think we're going to close the episode just by talking quickly
Yes.
about the books that we're reading right now. So, KG, why don't you start?
Yes.
What are you reading?
Yes. So I'm reading, again, not fantasy, but Save the Cat writes a novel by Jessica Brody. I just started reading it. I'm on like page 23, and it's another one of those how to structure your novels. Anyways, yeah, I'm only on page 23, so I don't know too much yet. But so far, I've got some tabs here. I think it's pretty useful, so we'll see. How about you, Oscar?
Yeah. I read it. It's somewhere over there in one of those books, and I think it's pretty
Yeah.
good. It helps, as you said, structuring your thoughts.
Yeah, need
Uh,
structure.
I'm reading. I'm reading. I'm not reading fantasy. I'm reading. Well, I'm about to start reading sci-fi. I just finished The Blade
Yes.
itself, that we talked about last week. This week, I'm
Yep.
starting with the Neuromancer by Willian Gibson. Um, this is the book that where the Matrix was based on. So I'm very excited to get into this. So
Nice.
we'll see how it goes.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Oscar, and thank you everyone for listening. It has been a blast as usual. Love speaking with you, love hearing from all of you, and I guess we'll see you next time.
We will. And don't forget to like and subscribe the video if you're watching on YouTube, and to
Yes.
subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to the show if you do it on as a podcast. Again, thank you very
All the
much, everybody.
details.
All the
Thank
details.
you. All the
Chat
details.
soon.
Bye.